I'm basically the problem. I've spent my entire career as a professor in medicine teaching medical school.
What are the top lies that you taught in medical school?
I get a pill for the arthritis. I get a pill for the lipids. I get a pill for hypertension, and I get a pill for diabetes. The problem with Western medicine is because of the need for specialization, where everyone is an expert in a very narrow area. Oftentimes, there's not a lot of crosstalk between specialties. These pills were just going to mask the symptoms. What can we do to address the underlying disease? Well, there's a simple thing, arguably the most powerful medicine that any of us will ever take, and that's
What's up, you guys? I am bringing on a professor who teaches these students at medical school all of the information that they know. And he recently came out with a book called Lies I Taught in Medical School. Today's conversation with Rob is really interesting because not only is he at the very forefront of what's being taught in medical schools, he actually taught it himself. And then when he picked up chronic disease of his own, he then realized through his own application of those solutions, it wasn't working. And then by his own research and dedication, he actually reversed his chronic diseases. Since then, has completely transformed his approach to medicine. We go into a lot of different topics, including how he reversed those diseases and what was actually taught in medical school, what he's changed now. So I hope that this is interesting and valuable to you. Please let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe. I talk about all things human optimization, exploration, life hacks. And this is certainly a life hack, Benny, because we are getting down to the bottom of it. Let me know your thoughts. Let's get into it. I don't know if you would agree with this, but it seems like almost everything that we have been taught, kind of like by doctors or dietitians, is almost backwards in a way. And, it's not even, I don't think it's necessarily their fault, but it just kind of keeps seeming like that, specifically when we're talking about chronic disease and preventing it. So yeah, if you wouldn't mind giving a little background of what your career is now, and then also what your mission is and how you got here specifically.
Yeah, no, thanks, Lauren. By the way, I love your program. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here today with you on it. And I know you've had a lot of guests on different topics, and they're coming from different places. I'll tell you where I'm coming from. I'm basically the problem. My background is I've spent my entire career as a professor in medicine, teaching medical school, as well as practicing medicine. But in the process, I got to do research and write, hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific papers. My lab received millions of dollars in money from drug companies and device makers and the federal government to do research. So I am sort of a mainstream physician, practitioner of the Western medicine. And although my book is really critical of Western medicine, I have to say, I still like Western medicine, and I think we owe it a lot. In the 20th century, it transformed our lives by, largely public health measures, and the pills and surgeries that were developed were so helpful for making the world truly a better place for people everywhere. And even today, if I get hit by a car, I'm going to want Western medicine to take out my spleen and give me a blood transfusion and do some stuff like that. But the problem is, and I think what we talk about in the book, and I think what we're going to talk about today, is when in the 21st century, we're facing literally a tsunami of what are called chronic diseases. Now, these were present in the 20th century, but in the 21st century, these are exploding, now taking, by some estimates, up to 80% of healthcare expenditures. And the problem is, when Western medicine takes the same pills and surgeries, that approach that was so successful in the 20th century, it doesn't really work on these diseases. What I mean by that is the pills and surgeries can be life-saving in the short term. The insulin will save the type 2 diabetic from dying of too much sugar. But in most cases, they only mask the symptoms, and the underlying so-called root cause of the disease isn't addressed, and the disease continues on. And I think what we're missing today is this root cause. And I found out the hard way. I was minding my own business, doing my own job, at the medical schools I've worked at, when suddenly I came down with 4 of these chronic diseases myself. I was in good company because most people today have at least one of these, and they don't even know it most of the time. But I was diagnosed with these 4 diseases. I went to my doctor. I was given 4 pills, 4 prescriptions for those, and I thought everything was great. But then I realized, as I dug deeper, these pills were just going to mask the symptoms. And the underlying disease was going to continue to progress and get worse and worse and worse. And what I eventually found out was, what can we do to address the underlying disease? Well, there's a simple thing, arguably the most powerful medicine that any of us will ever take, and that's lifestyle. That we can literally change the way we live for me, with relatively simple things I changed. And I was able to reverse all 4 of those chronic diseases and get off the prescriptions altogether. And really, that's the message of this book. And I've made it my mission now to communicate this message, hopefully, as best I can, so that other people don't make the same mistake that I made.
So, okay, what were the diseases the chronic diseases that you had? What were they called?
Yeah. And I've talked openly on social media and in the book and everything about it. It's no secret. One was a type of arthritis called gout. Another was an abnormality of blood lipids, sort of blood fats, dyslipidemia. The third one was hypertension. I'm in good company. Most adults have hypertension in this country, over almost 50%. And then the fourth one was pre-diabetes, which is a glucose abnormality that's just before you get full-on diabetes. And again, the diabetes, all 4 of these are exploding in numbers today. And the problem with Western medicine is because of the need for specialization, where everyone is an expert in a very narrow area, oftentimes there's not a lot of crosstalk between specialties. So an underlying root cause like metabolic disease, which I believe it is going to be missed. So I get a pill for the arthritis, I get a pill for the lipids, I get a pill for hypertension, and I get a pill for diabetes. And the problem is none of these pills treat the underlying cause. In fact, this metabolic dysfunction that's running rampant in our society, that's driving all these chronic diseases, there actually is no pill for it. There is no surgery for it. But there's something even better. Lifestyle is the way that we can reverse this and actually wind back the clock.
It's fascinating that you say the specialization thing, because I was just thinking about that today. What's one thing that every person has in common, right? Like every single person. We all eat every single day, multiple times a day or one time a day. Everybody eats food. And so, when I was growing up, it's like, I always used to think about this concept of diet and like a lifestyle. It sounds corny a little bit. It sounds kind of like, okay, yeah, sure. Like that's sort of a lame response. But in reality, actually, if we're talking about the one kind of central piece, it is the things that we consume all the time. And then, of course, that's part of your lifestyle that you're talking about here. And I don't know if you watched that, it was a YouTube video and it was on X, I think, and everywhere, but with the senator who had all of like Casey means and Callie means and Michaela Peterson. I don't remember what it was called, but do you know what I'm talking about? The Gathering?
Yeah. Casey's a French, great book, by the way, both of them, her brother too. They both wrote that book and they appeared with RFK, Robert Kennedy Jr. on Capitol Hill, along with Grace Price, which is a wonderful college student, a bunch of other people too. And they presented this message of metabolic health. And it's wonderful for the first time that I can remember to see on the national platform, the national level politicians talking about seed oils and inflammation and insulin resistance. And hopefully it's not going to be a partisan, political issue. There's a motto, make America healthy again. Well, that shouldn't be a political slogan. It should be that hopefully the Democrats and Republicans will both embrace, and whoever's in the White House will see the value of it, because it's something for everyone. It's not one political party or the other.
And I think when I saw that on, in the news, I was traveling when I saw that basically on the news or whatever, when RFK made that speech, I was floored, really, because it made such a public appearance for the first time. I think a lot of people, I talk about the carnivore lifestyle, the diet, the whole thing, eating meat. It is a pretty aggressive way to approach health. The reality is so many people are finding success, not just because they're eating meat, but they're removing like processed foods. And then, they have so much more energy and so much more vitality and everything else that comes from just removing something rather than adding another thing in. So, I wanted to talk about too with your book. It's called Lies I Taught in Medical School and the Truths That Can Save Your Life. I think that you touch on a lot of really important factors here. What are the top lies that you taught in medical school? And I also, before you answer that, I guess, what does it mean you taught in medical school? Like who are you teaching exactly?
Yeah, my background is I'm in radiology, so medical imaging. So, that's a silo also, right? It's a narrow area. But one thing about radiology, I think that gave me a little bit of perspective as a radiologist in medical imaging, we get to do a lot of stuff. We get to look at people's brains and we can see their hippocampal volumes, which is something that changes in Alzheimer's disease. We can literally see the changes in the brain in Alzheimer's disease. We look at the hearts and we can see the calcifications in the coronary arteries when they have atherosclerosis. We can see fatty liver, which is another finding in metabolic disease. And we can see certainly obesity. We can see the sequela of diabetes. And so this cornucopia of chronic diseases that we're facing, as someone in medical imaging, I was able to basically, they were shoved in my face every day from different imaging studies that I did. I would teach in radiology. So I teach radiologists in training, both doctors and technicians, but I would also teach medical students. And medical students haven't yet chosen a specialty. Medical students are, you go through 4 years of medical school, and then at the end of medical school, you decide, oh, I want to be a brain surgeon,
Okay.
or I want to be primary care or something like that. So I would be teaching them in the medical school, and I still do. I still have an appointment. And basically my whole career has been either at UCLA or USC, which are two medical schools in Los Angeles area where I'm based. So that's kind of what I'm doing. But since I went through this lifestyle change myself, I've kind of pivoted a little bit into doing something I never did before, which was give a lot of public lectures, not to medical societies, but to public groups. And this book that I wrote is for everybody. It's not a technical book. It's not a textbook. And, spending time on social media, which I didn't really before. And, but it's great. I'm meeting so many interesting people like yourself and other people now in the world we live in. With social media, you can make a lot of great connections. I was talking to one person that developed a fasting mimicking supplement. We know that fasting is healthy, right? Pretty much nobody argues with that. And so he took some people and fasted them. And as his PhD thesis, then he took their blood before and after fasting, so normal people, and he found certain compounds in the blood. And it turns out those compounds, when you take them without fasting, just by taking them every day, you get the effects of fasting, like you lose your appetite, and you also, your hemoglobin A1C drops and your metabolic markers get much healthier. And today I was just on the phone with a new friend who's an endocannabinoid microbiologist from Sweden. And he's worked with those compounds, and he identified them as basically they stimulate the receptors for GLP-1, which is, Ozempic and all these other drugs that are out there now. So these supplements you can take that mimic fasting will mimic the effects of GLP-1 agonists like Ozempic and the others that we've been hearing about so much, but without the side effects, which is really amazing. But anyway, I digress. Sorry.
Well, I think that's what's interesting is I've heard a lot of people in this. There's a lot of movement going from the ground up. People in the public sphere are talking about different ways to approach physical and mental health. It's not happening from, as you're talking about medical school. It seems like, how many classes did you take in nutrition in medical school yourself?
Yeah, I went to medical school a long time ago, but still Nick Norowitz is a friend. He's on social media very much. He's at Harvard Medical School, and it's the same way. You get basically one class in nutrition, and nutrition is the basis for metabolism. And the problem is nutrition science is dictated by food companies. Food companies drive the science. They drive the dietitian industry. My mom was a dietitian. I know how that works. But it gets worse. Medical science and medical education is driven not by the food industry so much, but by the pharmaceutical industry. What could go wrong, right?
What could possibly be wrong with that?
So we have all these pernicious, conscious or unconscious, untoward financial and other incentives that corrupt and pervert the knowledge that we get about the way the world is and the way our bodies work because of these forces that are acting
and
on it.
I think it's worth mentioning too that whenever we or anyone talks about a like I don't know, it sounds like a conspiracy, like big food and big pharma are controlling this and that. Of course, it sounds like a conspiracy. I think it sounds like a conspiracy. But when you take a step back and you recognize we're talking about sales here, and sales really does run the world. We're just talking about basic sales. It's just, and I'm all for capitalism. I'm benefiting from it right now, talking to you. So I'm in support of capitalism. I get to do this and all that. But the reality is people want to make money. And people want to create a thing that they can sell to make money. And I think often with big pharma, it's like, it's so easy to make people out who say, okay, well, a lot of the, dietitians information comes from big food, big pharma. Oh, that's a conspiracy. Well, not necessarily. A lot of times big food and big pharma have ties to other organizations that affect their bottom line. And you might even be, like you said, unconscious to the biases that one has as somebody who's part of those companies, right? So it's not just like this obvious Darth Vader always, who's just like trying to rule the world.
Yeah. It's sort of the way the world works, but we have to be aware of it. Like, I think you've probably talked about this with your audience in the 1980s, big tobacco basically saw the writing on the wall and they pivoted and purchased junk food companies, and what that meant was big tobacco companies were experts in marketing, in 7-Elevens and gas stations and with bright colored boxes. The only thing was they weren't allowed to sell to children because of the laws against tobacco. But when they pivoted into junk food, suddenly now you see junk food in the 7-Elevens, in the checkout lines, in the gas stations, and they're being sold to children with cartoon characters on the boxes and cereals and everything because it's legal. It's not illegal to sell junk food to children, but it's the same tobacco industry that developed these powerful marketing strategies to go there. Or you take the food pyramid, that defines the food we eat. And Nina Teicholz and others recently published that the current food pyramid, 95% of the USDA committee that defined it had ties to big food, which was a conflict of interest. So yeah, it just, it goes on and on.
Yeah, I actually
and
made
on.
a video about that. I'll attach for anybody who wants to see it because it's so valuable to see. I mean, it matters. This is the type of thing and this is kind of going back to your career as far as, teaching in medical school. It's fascinating that, I'm not in the medical field at all, or I wasn't, basically until now. But my whole career, I did international affairs in college, and that was more my scope of things, and then business. But I always kind of thought for some reason that in medical school, you sort of like picked something specialized from the beginning, I guess. But it's really not like that. It's more generic, sort of like an undergrad maybe. And then you pick after that what you want to specialize in. With your experience now, and you had these 4 chronic diseases that you then reversed. In your eyes, are there like major kind of pillars of misinformation that you feel is taught in medical school that should be changed or, could be changed as it pertains to lifestyle, let's say, or diet?
Well, yeah. I mean, when I got those 4 diseases, I'd heard of lifestyle. Right. Everybody's heard of lifestyle. The first thing I asked the doctor was, hey, what about lifestyle? Is that going to work? And they go, nah, it really doesn't work. You're going to be on these pills for the rest of your life. So get used to it. And sadly, that's the common impression, that lifestyle doesn't work. But I think it actually does. And, example is type 2 diabetes, which is the sort of the gateway drug for all these other chronic diseases. You don't have to have type 2 diabetes to get Alzheimer's, but it drives in. It's metabolic dysfunction. One of the manifestations is this type 2 diabetes. The American Diabetic Association and every university you go to, the standard treatment for type 2 diabetes, which is caused by eating too many carbohydrates and spiking your insulin, and driving insulin resistance, is to give drugs, things like metformin, and then eventually to give insulin to control the blood sugar. And the problem is the insulin will save your life, but it won't stop the chronic progression of the disease. In other words, the disease will continue and you'll amputate your feet. The number 1 cause of surgical amputations is type 2 diabetes. your kidneys may fail. The number one cause of renal failure and dialysis is type 2 diabetes, and on and on and on, all those other things. What isn't emphasized enough is if you have type 2 diabetes and you don't want the pills or surgery, there's one other thing you can do. If it's a problem caused by eating carbohydrates, switch to a carnivore diet or a low carb diet. And for most people, not all, but most people, they're able to reverse their type 2 diabetes in controlled prospective studies even. This has been shown. And the interesting thing is when you control your diabetes with insulin, it's a chronic progressive disease. You could look forward to all those things happening down the road. When you reverse it with lifestyle, primarily diet, and interesting things happen. It doesn't progress anymore. In other words, you've put your disease into remission. So these things don't happen. And I think people need to be made aware of that. That sort of thing with education, that the things we're using for these chronic diseases may treat the symptoms and be life-saving in the short term, but they don't do anything about the underlying, in many cases, the underlying progression of the disease. And the main driver for that is metabolic dysfunction, which drives all of these diseases.
Yeah, and the thing about that too, that I've always thought was so interesting is when you don't know much about a certain, let's say, skill set or project, sometimes the simplest answer is the truth. Or it becomes like, let's say it's not the truth, but the simplest answer is often the truth. And that becomes obvious to the people that aren't so in the weeds, maybe. So before I understood anything about insulin or type 2 diabetes, I was like, why would you give more insulin to people? Just take out the thing that's making them have the resistance in the first place, which is like the sugar, basically, or, like carbs and stuff like that. And it just seems that was years ago when I had, again, I had no background, but it seems obvious in a way where it's like, yeah, but what is what are the things that are holding the medical field back from the obvious like that?
Well, the American Diabetic Association, we'll start with that, is the leading informational scientific society for diabetes in the United States and all over the world. It's really whatever they say goes. So they have their website and they have recipes for diabetics, which have sugar added to the recipe, which sugar is a carbohydrate and it will spike their insulin. But their advice is just, quote, cover it with insulin. In other words, take more insulin and control the sugar. And you wonder, why are they giving that advice? But then on the same page as the ad is one of their sponsors. It's DaVita Corporation. What's DaVita Corporation? Well, your audience may not know, but they're one of the largest makers of dialysis and renal, what you need when you have kidney failure, basically. And the number one cause of kidney failure is people who put sugar on their food and get type 2 diabetes and then add more insulin. So there's those effects. The American Heart Association is the trusted source for medical information, but they have on their website that seed oils, which I believe are pro-inflammatory, things like corn oil, canola oil. These seed oils are actually heart healthy, they say. You wonder, why would they say that? Well, if you go back, the American Heart Association in the middle of the last century was funded by a multi-million-dollar grant from Procter & Gamble. Who's Procter & Gamble? Well, they're the company that took a lubricant that was developed for German U-boats in World War I, and it was a thickened, white, creamy substance. And they found out that people would eat it. And they named it Crisco, and then they sold it as a food and then developed other things like canola oil and corn oil, and which now the American Heart Association says are heart healthy. And you can go down, on and on with each of these societies, the dietitians, you go to their meetings, they're funded by Coca-Cola and McDonald's. Yeah. What's right. That about?
And that's the thing. Again, it goes back to this whole just like thinking through a sales perspective, right? Crisco is cheaper than the alternative, which was, real butter or animal fat. There's just bigger margins there.
Yeah, and if I can interject one thing in there, the reason those things are cheaper, is particular canola oil or corn oil or soybean oil, which are these terrible seed oils, which now are in every fryer in the world. And when they're heated up, they break down into toxic compounds. And they're also in salad dressings and everything else. The reason they're used so much is that they're artificially low in price. In other words, our government in the United States subsidizes them with a farm bill, pays not only for tobacco production, go figure that out, but also for corn and soybean production so that the price is actually low. So high fructose corn syrup replaced cane sugar. One of the reasons it replaced cane sugar in the 1980s, all Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and everything else used to be with different types of cane type sugars, but they switched to this thing called high fructose corn syrup, which is made from corn. And one reason is because it's very, very cheap.
Right. It's always and
subsidized.
Yep, it's always like the bottom line. Again, it goes just back to, I would have to assume that at the time they probably didn't know any better, that it was so terrible for the health. Maybe now it's different. I think probably different, but at the time, maybe not.
Yeah. I mean, in my heart of hearts, as a person, I don't think most people get up and want to harm anyone else or do things that are intentionally going to harm people, but it's complicated and there's enough of nuance and shading. I believe some of these choices actually do harm people.
No, I agree. So, I mean, circling back to some of the stuff with medical school, I just find it so interesting that you actually are kind of at the forefront of seeing what medical school is teaching these students. And, I think that it's just beyond fascinating because every doctor, in my opinion, is trying to do the right thing. Like, I don't think somebody gets into trying to do that much work and that much money and that much schooling because they want to harm people. They're well intended. But it sounds like some of the issues from your experience is like specialization is a real problem in when we're coming down to figuring out what a baseline solution might be. The lack of nutrition education is crazy and needs to be fixed because obviously that's goes into lifestyle. So medical school should build in more nutrition, right? At least in my opinion, but I think we're on the same page with that. Is there another thing there that you think medical school is lacking?
Yeah, I mean, there's corruption in our peer-reviewed writing process. We look at what are called peer-reviewed scientific papers. These are papers published in a scientific journal that have been reviewed by a collection of peers. Even this process is corrupted. There's a recent study that came out that said that that showed that papers that were critical of fast food, or they did a study, is fast food or junk food harmful? And when they were funded by the junk food industry, most of them came out and said, no, they weren't, when they were funded by big food people, obviously. But when they were independently funded, the paper said, oh, yeah, junk food is harmful. Does that make sense?
So you're saying when the peer-reviewed study, like the research that was done for the peer-reviewed papers to be studied, basically, when they were funded by big groups that were like big food, they denied that it was processed food was bad. Is that what you're saying? Yeah,
it was consistently less critical of big food when the funding was from big food. And I experienced that firsthand when my lab would review a new drug. The drug company would give us money to do the study, to review the drug, and then we'd write a paper on it. But they would say, we have first right of refusal on the paper. In other words, if we don't like the results of the paper, we can block it. Now, so what does that mean? Well, only articles that are favorable about the drug will ever get published, and that's changing today. But, that's the type of thing that was going on before. And in the book, we talked, famously Harvard School of Nutrition. Some of their scientists there were caught with receiving money that wasn't disclosed. It was never disclosed, but it was discovered in the 21st century, where they were paid by the sugar lobby to write that saturated fats are harmful, and that has been going on, and it's still happening. I mean, even now, problems with reliability in these peer-reviewed papers. Just recently, one of the directors of the federal government neuroscience agency, who'd written over 120 papers on Alzheimer's disease, was found out that his data was falsified. And a lot of it supported the fact that beta amyloid was the cause of Alzheimer's disease, but it just shows that, there is corruption, either intentional or even unintentional sometimes, that even gets at our peer-reviewed system. So, we always have to be critical of the science. We always have to keep asking ourselves, is this true? And always keep asking.
So how did
questions.
They find out that his stuff was faulty? How did that come out? Because there's such a machine behind it. You know what I mean? Like, there's big money behind making sure this information is swayed a type of way. How was it revealed maybe that his was corrupt?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember his particular one. We talk about one in the book that was a similar type thing. It may have been this individual, but basically it even got down to where his figures that he used in the publication had been photoshopped, and people could see somebody notice that it was a direct copy of another page, which was the photoshopping effect. And it was from there they said, hey, can you send us the original data? And it unraveled.
You know what I think is going to happen in the very near future? I was talking about this with one of my really great friends. I think AI is about to do a lot of revealing of a lot of things, because you can't falsify a lot of things with AI. It catches you, or it can reveal, okay, this has actually been copied or photoshopped, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in a split second. So I do think that that's about to happen quite a bit. Who you should meet is John Abramson. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he wrote a book called Sickening: How Big Pharma Broke American Healthcare. And
oh no, I'd love to read it. I'll put that on my list.
I had him on. Yeah. He talks specifically about peer-reviewed studies, and basically he explains how he was a consultant. He was contracted for the largest criminal case in American history, and they settled. And it was with a pharmaceutical product, and essentially they settled. He had access to the hard drives for all of the hard drives for the company, the CEO, the CMO, everybody. And he's under an NDA, so he can't talk about everything, but he expresses how not only that, but then all the peer-reviewed studies, basically the first people, like you mentioned, that see it are the people that are paying for the research. They see the raw data. They're the only ones that see the raw data, not the peers who are reviewing it. The peers get the second whack at it, where they see what essentially like the approved data is. And of course, who's approving the data? It's the people that fund the research itself. And so, if you have Big Food, Big Pharma, or any other third party that's even involved in it whatsoever, I mean, there's going to be a bias no matter what, unless you're like, an angel and, it's crazy.
Yeah. And the more we're aware of that, we have to constantly be on the lookout. Yeah. And hopefully AI, people are even talking about, having completely AI generated thesis and then, almost do the study and the analysis with AI. So, it's changing so fast. It's going to be an exciting time, I think.
Well, I think what I wanted to lean into just a little bit was this, your field of radiology. You touched on it before. I'm not so familiar with it. I wish I was more. You mentioned a lot of how you kind of get access to seeing what's going on with the body through your career. But I guess how does this tie into, how does it teach you about people's nutrition or their lifestyle, right? Like, are there specific patterns that you get access to in that field?
Yeah, I mean, we look at the imaging data, and so this is a much higher level thing. But even radiology is at fault here. There's one of my chapters of the book. I talk about something called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease,
which is so much sense.
A weird name. Yeah, it didn't exist before 1980, and now it's the number one cause of liver failure and liver transplants. And I believe the evidence is very strong. It's been shown in controlled studies that it's caused by fructose damage to the liver, just like ethanol damages the liver. Fructose has many of the same metabolic pathways, even though still universities today say if you have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, then just eat less fat, lose weight. It's like the thinking isn't there. But to radiology's thing, the liver is seen on any image through the abdomen, includes the liver pretty much, any cross-sectional imaging like MR or CT. And it's possible to measure the liver fatty density. And the problem is radiologists generally don't read it out or don't even comment on it unless it's very severe. And somebody did a study we talked about in the book that they looked at people having CT scans of their abdomen for other reasons unrelated to liver disease. And they looked at, thousands of these patients, and up to 50% of them had fatty liver disease. But when they looked at the radiology reports, they were mentioned in less than 10% of the studies, only the extremely severe ones. But people who have this condition need to know about it early, because it's another marker of metabolic disease. It's this same general thing: insulin resistance, inflammation, oxidation. Fatty liver goes hand in hand with all of these.
Now, when you say metabolic disease, I know what you mean, but I think a lot of people say it. I've interviewed a lot of people who are, I'm triangulating all of this, saying the same thing. Everybody's who's kind of getting out of the dogma has sort of gotten to that as the landing point. How do you summarize for a layperson like what that is?
Metabolic disease. Yeah, it's a great question. It was first, metabolic syndrome was first described by Dr. Gerald Reaven at Stanford in the end of the 20th century. And he came up with this association of 5 things, with hypertension, elevated glucose, elevated triglycerides, low HDL, and increased abdominal girth. And the people who had this weird constellation of symptoms had what he called syndrome X. Eventually, he called it metabolic syndrome. And eventually, he admitted it's basically insulin resistance, which is when our body begins to fail on a metabolic level. Metabolism is run by our mitochondria. So it's basically a abnormality, the powerhouse of the cell, fundamentally with glucose metabolism. So the metabolically healthy lifestyles we talk about wind up switching people off glucose metabolism and into oftentimes ketone metabolism, or a ketogenic type diet, where they switch from burning glucose in many of the cells of their body to burning ketones. And when you do that, psychiatric conditions in some, but not all patients, but some patients actually reverse. In Alzheimer's patients, when you go into ketosis, some of the people regain their memory. And, again, not all, but some people have dramatic responses. Same thing all the way down with all these things. So that it seems like this metabolic disease, which those five markers that Dr. Raven mentioned, when they did a study of adults in America, 88% of adults have at least one of those metabolic markers. So most of us are by far metabolically unhealthy. And it's a common thing that's really ignored by conventional medicine, because conventional medicine, like with me, they look at the arthritis with the gout, and they look at the hypertension, and they look at the diabetes, and they don't see the link when they're actually caused by the same thing. Underlying metabolic illness drives all that. Now, it manifests differently in different people. Like, I may get Alzheimer's, but I won't get cancer. Somebody else may get cancer and they may get diabetes. Some other person may be obese and with hypertension, and that's controlled by our genetics somewhat, but and our lifestyle on top of it. But it's really fundamental. And I think, we're missing the boat by not teaching patients about it and teaching doctors about it.
And that's not taught, right? That specific topic is not really taught in medical school. You're not seeing that, correct?
Yeah. I mean, we're, trying to do it more and more, but we're up against, the American Diabetic Association. We're up against the American Heart Association, these other associations that believe that, saturated fat is bad for you. And so we want to eat a high carb, low fat diet, which is, it's basically either or. And I'm putting plant and animal aside, because, I think you can be healthy on a plant diet or an animal diet or anything in between, or you can be very unhealthy. But the big thing is, between fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, when people switch their diet, they keep the protein pretty much constant, And it's basically just increasing carbs, lowering fat, or increasing fat and lowering carbs. So when people go, if the conventional wisdom is that high fat diets cause heart disease, and that's what we've been told for the last 70 years, then the best diet for that is going to be a low fat diet, which unfortunately means a high carb diet, which is what America's been eating and what's been recommended to us. And that's the metabolically worst kind of diet to have.
So, okay, let me ask you this. With all of this information that you've gathered, you've reversed your chronic disease yourself. You've obviously spent a lot of time self-educating, and also you were in medical school. So you've got all of these different perspectives, of how one can be healthy. What do you eat? Or what would you say your day looks like with food?
Yeah, I mean, again, food eating's been so politicized. I used to be a vegan. I was a vegan for a while. I've been a carnivore. I've been everything in between. I love my vegan friends. I love my carnivore friends like you, so I think that's not the point. I think the point is what we eat and when we eat. So when I eat, no more snacking. I actually skip breakfast. I usually skip lunch. I have one meal a day, usually when my kids get home from school. And then what do I eat? I eat low carb. So I try and avoid refined carbohydrates, sugars, starches, grains, flour, rice. Get rid of those things that drive insulin and, turn on mTOR. In addition, when I eat fats, I eat healthy fats. It's not enough just to eat a lot of fats, because if you eat junk fats with seed oils, you're going to drive inflammation and everything else, even if you're on a low carb diet. So I'm low carb, but I'm also no seed oils. So I get rid of seed oils and eat things like avocado oil, olive oil, and then saturated fats and cream and butter and all the stuff that my dietitian mom told me not to eat before. And then finally, last thing I avoid is grains. Any kind of grain, even whole grains. I don't have celiac disease. I don't have gluten allergy, but I believe grains in many people, drive inflammation. We have low grade inflammatory reaction to the proteins on the grain, glutens and other proteins. And if that's not enough, in the U.S. at least, grains are soaked, most of them, in a toxic weed killer called glyphosate, which is banned in 30 countries in the world because of its risk of cancer. And then finally, grains have a lot of carbohydrates. So, this is another reason not to eat them. But those three things: low carb, low seed oil, and no grains.
Would it be safe to say that you eat mostly like a meat-based lifestyle, kind of like a carnivore close to it? And I'm saying this also not from a position of like rah carnivore. I don't care. I really think that the whole tribal thing between carnivore and vegan, it's just a marketing scheme like everything else. And it's silly. You can be successful both ways. I eat carnivore. That's what I prefer, but I have vegan friends too. So yeah, I'm just curious. What would you say you align with mostly?
Yeah. I mean, I'm basically lazy. It's very hard to be healthy as a vegan. There's tons of vegan junk food. And that's what I ate when I was a vegan. And, also plant-based diets, lack some nutrients that we have to pay attention to, and we have to make sure we get them. There are plenty of carnivore human civilizations historically who eat nothing but meat largely, which is practically no carbohydrates, and they do fine. Our meat is a very nutrient-rich food source, so you can just eat meat and you'll do fine, and whereas if you just eat plants, you've really, really got to watch it. It's a lot of work to be healthy as a vegan and stay healthy. As a carnivore, it's much easier, I think. And, I like eating meat, and I find, my diet centers around eating meat, because meat is low carb by definition.
I mean, one of the benefits I found with eating carnivore, the reason I became a coach in the space actually is because for my whole life, I had an eating disorder. Like most kids, unfortunately, in America, you have this really unhealthy relationship to food, and then you starve yourself for years. It's not like a 1-2 month thing, right? It's like your lifestyle is you're hungry. That's basically how you are. And so that causes anxiety, and that causes, lack of sleep, and that you don't feel normal, but you don't feel normal until you know what normal feels like. And I didn't know what normal felt like until I really did dive into the carnivore lifestyle. And then, yeah, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so easy. Because I didn't grow up cooking. My mom owned restaurants and my dad can't cook at all. So like, that's kind of just, it never was really taught to me because we would just have the restaurants to get food and stuff. And then when I never had the skill set for cooking and I didn't really want to eat food because I was scared of food. I didn't want to like put on weight, but the carnivore lifestyle gave me this like freedom to just be full. And then I didn't really have to try that hard, like cook a steak, cook some ground beef, some bacon and eggs, whatever. And I agree with you. I think you can be healthy on a vegan lifestyle too. In fact, more power to you if you are, because you're doing it likely to protect animals. And I'm all in support of that. I get that. But I do think that, it's one of the things you talk about in the book, weight loss, exercise, and calories, how that's a whole kind of lie that's being told. You got to just burn calories and do a ton of working out to like look the way you want to look. It's not true. And I discovered that with carnivore. I mean, if that's something you wanted to touch on, I found that really fascinating.
Yeah, no, we talked before at the break. I'm really looking forward to having you on my podcast. And I want to dive into your carnivore story and talk about that. People want a chapter of the book. They can download it from my website. It's a free chapter, both audio and PDF. They're welcome.
That would be amazing. What is your YouTube channel name or your podcast?
Well, my website and both YouTube channel is robertlufkinmd.com.
Gotcha.
Is the website.
Okay. And I'll link that below. Yeah. I mean, I just really appreciate the time. Thank you so much for chatting. And
this has been
we'll
fun.
Talk soon. Awesome.